This computer. Okay. As you know, we were challenged last week not to hit record, but we hit record this day, and we've got, this is week 2 of our study on biblical joy. And just a quick review, we're trying to understand the concept of last week of understand the concept of biblical joy. And we looked at 2 things, understanding words, and then looking at the conditions that are present for us to experience that joy. And we talked about the fact that this place is good, and acknowledging God in that this place is good, acknowledging that there are 2 kingdoms in play, realizing that the joy we are talking about is inexplicable to those who do not have faith in God, understanding that it's based on delighting in the Lord. And then we ended last week with talking about peace and joy and how they're intertwined. And we looked at Philippians 4, verse 8 in particular. And we'll get back to the concept of peace and joy being intertwined. And at the very end, we challenged everybody to think about Jesus being joyful, and maybe different from how we were raised in the faith, thinking that Jesus was more pious or stern.
Yeah.
There we go. Today, we're going to look, this is the second part, and we're going to look for this search for joy and happiness. And the first part of it isn't as much biblically based. There's Kathy. Is not as biblically based, but giving some background with the understanding that since the beginning of time, humankind have been on the search for joy.
Yeah, and this, we talked last week about the fact that this joy that we talk about is a concept. It's not something that you can just write a sentence definition of. And that you know, people argue over words, but sometimes to understand a concept, we mentioned you kind of have to circle it, but also sometimes it helps to talk about what it's not. As Mary mentioned, that people have been looking for this same thing. They may not know it exactly, but they've been looking for the same thing as far back as there have been people. And as part of that, part of getting you to understand that you see people searching in a lot of ways. When we taught a class years ago, we had one of the people in the class bring us some books on Edgar Cayce and crystals, which we thought was interesting. Here, you'll like this, but people are looking. And what's surprising or you know, I guess enlightening is that a lot of the time they just resist any reference to God while they do it. So bear with me. I want to go through this because you'll see these things in the world around you. You'll see people doing some of these things, and it's good to understand that people want this joy and peace. They go about it in some odd ways. So ancient Greek philosophers spent some of them their whole lives looking for this. And there's a word that they coined, you know, 600 BC or something, a Greek word, ataraxia. And ataraxia is this, you know, this state that they want. And out of the pursuit of this, there are all these fields of philosophy: Epicureanism, Stoicism, Pyrrhoism, and they're all trying to find a formula to get to this ataraxia. And what is that? You remember I told you that trying to define joy is fruitless. Well, ataraxia is basically, they finally came down to this state of being unperturbed, just being not disturbed by anything, so that you're sort of, you know, there may not be any lows, there are no highs, but at least you're not disturbed by stuff. And they're over, now thousands of years, they go out looking for it. One of the things you've heard of Stoicism. They actually seek, the idea that you just withstand everything without any sort of emotion. And it comes down to, that's where the word apathy comes from, because they have another word that you get to the point that you just sort of don't care about anything. Now, it doesn't mean that, but that was the goal. That's what you try and get to, is a point of being undisturbed or unperturbed by anything. What I found this last couple of weeks looking at this, there are a number of sort of religion, sort of philosophy, but their goal is to get to a point that you have no expectations. You empty yourself of expectations, therefore you won't be disappointed when life, comes up double zeros or whatever, that snake eyes. Well, I didn't have any expectations. So I reach a point, I'm just not disturbed about anything. That is not life more abundant.
That is not biblical joy.
It is not biblical joy, a state of being unperturbed. And there's another term they come up with, eudaimonia, which literally means good spirit. It's as close as you can come to it. And so what I want you to understand, what I want you to see, the reason I'm doing this is this idea of joy. When we talk about joy, it's not something that the church or churches cooked up. People look for this. People go out searching, and they try and, like I say, they try and come up with a cookbook, with a recipe of how you get there. And they've been doing it for thousands of years. You flash forward to today, and I went out looking at all sorts of modern versions of this. And what I discovered, it's a long way to go, is what I discovered that these religions and philosophies all have one thing in common. They're looking for this joy within themselves. They're looking for a way to develop themselves, to find their best self. It's always inward looking. And I went over religion after religion and philosophy after philosophy. And I'll spare you some of I will say on eudaimonia, this idea of good spirit, there's a modern day psychological sort of a checklist for how we get there. Know your life goals. 2, focus on your capabilities and skills towards achieving those goals. 3, developing your best potentials. 4, get engaged in these activities. And 5, express yourself. They're searching for the joy that we're talking about, but you notice how each one of those is me. I'm going to create this. I'm going to find it within myself. And I thought when I read this, it sounds like Stephen Covey. I mean, it's exactly, the 7 habits of highly effective people. So before,
an aside, so Scott and I met on the internet back in the late 90s, and I was a self-help guru. None of those books are that anymore, but I had all those, and I was a big Stephen Covey fan, and I thought we weren't going to have a second date because of the Stephen Covey fanness. But go ahead.
Well. So I'm going to pause. We're going to move over more to scriptures, but I want to talk about this because this idea of I want happiness, I want joy, I want peace, and I look for it within me. And there's a reason why this stuff has gone on for thousands of years, and there are so many different recipes, because that's not where it comes from. But the Stephen Covey 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, Mary, as she said, had a lot of self-help books. And if you've ever looked at that book, what I bet you haven't looked at is the afterword, the epilogue. Nobody ever reads that. It's back, there's a blank page, and then there's a word directly from Stephen Covey, this little story that he tells. And I explained that to Mary, and there I just get the owl eyes, blink, blink.
I'm better now.
But Covey, yeah, but Covey talked about when he was writing his book, their family lived in Hawaii. They would drop the kids at school, get on their little scooter, head down to this little section of beach that nobody was at. They would pick a pineapple and cut it up. He would go get lobsters, go swim and snorkel and get lobsters. And then she would do stuff on the beach and he would write the book. And I thought to myself when I read it, because I read the prologue first. I read things from back to front a lot, but they were probably never happier. He got rich, he got famous, he did speaking tours, leave the kids at home while I go, and then they write their own books on habits of highly effective teenage. Effective at what? But here they had this life. They were probably never happier than they were during that time. And he left it behind. He said, what's important to me is fame and fortune. And I had this conversation with Mary. She was living in a house, and there was a small house in the back where the caretaker, the nanny for the kid, there's a couple, and they had come illegally at one point, but they naturalized, but they had come and they're living in this little house behind hers. And I asked Mary if I could guarantee you would be happy every single day, would you trade places with them? Would you become them, live in the little house in the back, and they come live in the front, and lives literally become them? And she kept saying, well, no. Well, why not? Well, because I wouldn't have this. Well, no, you don't need that because I've already told you you'll be happy. Well, I love to travel, and I wouldn't be able to travel. And I said that you would be happy not traveling. And well, education for the kids. And I said, it wouldn't disturb you. You'd be happy. And she, at that point, couldn't conceive of anything where all the stuff. And I said, if the stuff isn't making you happy, what is it that you can't leave? Why is that? And as we talk about this, what we see in the religions and the philosophies is that they all come up to a point of being forced to acknowledge that God exists, and they turn and run away from it. And it's in their literature. They will write it. Since that obviously can't be it, we go looking somewhere else. And this is I know this is not scriptural, but this is in getting to this idea that we talk about joy. They keep searching, because when they come up to the threshold of acknowledging that there is a God, and you see this in the world around you, they say, nope, that can't be it. And they turn and look somewhere else. And it seems to not be working out well for them. It seems that over a long period of time, they'll go through periods. If everything's going your way, it's kind of easy to say, well, I'm happy. I got my new toy, I got this. But if you really meet people like I try to do, they don't stay very joyful. And there's a reason for that. So now let's move back to scriptures that we have.
Can I do a side note on C.S. Lewis?
Yeah, that's another good one.
So C.S. Lewis, and many of you, wrote Chronicles of Narnia and Mere Christianity. And he had a tremendously difficult youth. His mom died when he was 7. He and his brother were put into 2 separate boarding schools and the one he was in was horrible. In fact, when he got out of the boarding school, the headmaster was institutionalized for being insane. One of his books that he wrote was Searching for Joy?
Surprised by Joy.
Oh, Surprised by Joy was it was a biography of his early life. But he has some, and he found joy ultimately through his relationship with Jesus Christ, and that, and then he wrote Chronicles of Narnia and a lot of different things. But he has some wonderful quotes, and I'm just going to read 3 of them. If we find ourselves with a desire that nothing in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that we were made for another world. And that goes back to the concept that we had last week of there is 2 kingdoms at work here. Human history is the long, terrible story of man trying to find something other than God, which will make him happy.
So I didn't come up with that on my own.
No, you
Somebody got
didn't.
there first.
Yeah. And third, don't let your happiness depend on something you may lose. Anyhow, so I'm going to get that book about Surprised by Joy. It sounds like it would be a good book to read.
And,
Isn't that also related to Buddhism?
and I've got a sheet here on Buddhism, and I realized that what I try to do is not give anyone an excuse to say, oh, you're attacking this denomination or this religion, but Buddhism does the meditation. It's inward looking. You find the answers within yourself, and I know people get defensive, but what I keep finding over and over again is these other religions and philosophies tend to be inward looking. Why is that so appealing to us? Here's a side note. Why is that so appealing to humans? The idea, and we like to believe that we're important, that we're powerful. And if you look back with Genesis, the creation story, and I realize I'm not saying that it is a blow by blow, and yet it is a representation of something. There's a reason why some of these things were inspired. But what is the temptation that the Adam and Eve are faced with? Why, if you do this, you'll be equal to God. You'll be wise like God is. And what people like is just to bypass the God part and say, I am powerful. And so the answer to it is yes. I'm just not going to get in the weeds on Buddhism, but it's inward looking. It is a way of developing me so that I can create this joy, this good life, if you will, good spirit that I desire. And there's the lacking part. So let's.
Should we move on to Corinthians 13? So we
Yeah,
want to move on
yeah.
to? And what would you like me to read?
Yeah, in just a second.
Okay.
This during the study last week, the word search led me all the way back to Genesis. And I told you, all of a sudden, I'm back at the beginning, and it says that after each step, God looked at this and saw that it was good. And I realized, because some of these words have implications, it's related. It is part of it. And we talked about peace, and we'll talk about peace more today. But I find that peace is also related to the joy. They're all wrapped up. It is different aspects of the same thing. But now we go back to the word that we use a lot, love. In the New Testament, there's the word that they use for this godly love is agape. Greeks had 4 different words for love: eros, philos, agape, and storge, right? So agape, they didn't use very much. It was just largely sort of out there, but we don't talk about it. It is this selfless love for someone that doesn't expect anything in return. Does that sound familiar? Jean has said, we talked about that last week, this word that is this gift from God. And you realize now that agape is this unused sort of word for love. So when they began trying to bring Christianity, the following Christ, to people who speak Greek, they reached out and grabbed a Greek word. Well, that one's not really being used. It is a selfless love for something other than yourself. And so I begin to see once again that these things are all tied together. And so Mary's going to read. This is from Corinthians. Most of you are familiar with, they call it the love chapter. They read it at weddings all the time. Even if you don't read the Bible or don't believe or anything else, you may well have heard this at a wedding. But let's listen to it and then we'll talk.
Do you want me to stop at certain points? I guess you'll tell me when to. 13, 1 Corinthians, chapter 13, and there's 13 verses in 1 Corinthians, chapter 13. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a ringing gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have absolute faith, so to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and exalt in the surrender of my body, but have not love, I gain nothing.
All right, stop there. So Paul starts out in this. He's talking about love. And he says, if I speak with the tongues of men and angels, and this, speaking in tongues, if I do these wonderful things and I don't have agape, I don't have this love, it's just nothing more than like a ringing bell, a clanging. So I'm making noise because it doesn't last. It doesn't amount to anything. And if I have the gift of prophecy and I can understand everything and I don't have agape love, Paul says it's worthless. It doesn't amount to anything. And even says, if I give away everything to the poor and offer up my body, I'm actually martyred, and I don't have love, doesn't add up to anything. We've told a story. We had a daughter in San Antonio. They have something called Christmas Under the Bridge. And the homeless people, that a lot of them hang out under bridges and stuff, one day a year, they get them down and they give them stuff. And they set up hot dog trailers and they do this thing. And all of the who's who, the really powerful people, they donate some money and they come down and get some pictures taken. And Amanda went down and worked at it. And she was serving food and she was doing things. And she said, I realized, and we didn't push this, I mean, she just sees that these very powerful people are over in a circle. And all of the poor homeless people are over here. And she said they never contacted them. They didn't really want anything to do with them. We just want to, we're going to do something benevolent for a day. And what they get out of it, the acclaim, the kudos, everything that they get. And Paul is saying, if I do this kind of thing and I don't have agape, it doesn't amount to anything. It doesn't, there's no gain in that. He says at the end, I gain nothing. But he says, if I don't have love, if I don't have this agape, well, how does that help us? Because we've already said these things that are concepts. You go, okay, fine. What is that? How do I get it? Well, Paul, being Paul, the next little section he goes into and he says, okay, I've told you, you got to have this. Now I'm going to tell you something, but you're going to also notice Paul doesn't give you a one sentence definition because it's a concept. So we give examples. We say what it is and what it isn't. So listen to the next section.
And this is the part that you hear in weddings. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no account of wrongs. Love takes no pleasure in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things.
Go ahead.
Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be restrained. Where there is knowledge, it will be dismissed. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when the perfect comes, the partial passes away.
Okay. So I'm going to try and make a case. I'm going to try and persuade you, because as we were studying and as I'm running down words and things, it leads me back here. And he's explaining what this love is. Love is patient, right? You think, well, okay, what does that have to do with joy? Well, first of all, you don't have to be patient unless something isn't going your way. and generally somebody. We're patient mostly with people, although we can be patient with circumstances, but you don't need patience unless there's something that's not going your way. And then you can either be impatient with it or be patient, right? Now, if things are not going your way and you're impatient, what are the chances that you're feeling joyful at the time? And they're very, very close to zero. I'm impatient, I'm upset, I'm annoyed with you. Carol, I'm annoyed with you. And I don't feel joyful. I'm impatient with you, right? That's how we get. And it just all of a sudden this thing opens up and I realize that he's describing these things that prevent us from being joyful or that get in the way of, or that we choose over being joyful, over experiencing this kind of joy. It's patient. It does not envy. Envy, coveting. Coveting is one of the 10 commandments, right? But envy, you look at something, either it's the possessions, or it may be that someone's getting more kudos than you. They're more important than you. And we envy that. We look at that and go, that should be me. I'm better than that. I'm smarter than that. And, and I want what that person has. I want you to think about joy and think about being in that state where you envy, and the two don't fit with each other. The likelihood is at the moment that you're saying experiencing the envy, you're probably not joyful. And I don't think this is a stretch. As a matter of fact, I realize that the places we get where we are not feeling joy, where we're not joyful, Paul encompasses just a whole lot of them in this discussion of love. It's not rude. At the moment that I'm being rude, I'm probably not feeling joyful. I see that. I told you about the guy who knocked a basket out of a woman's hand. I mean, he literally ripped it from her hands without noticing her. But I had someone take a run at me with their vehicle in a parking lot this week. He didn't want to slow down. Actually, she didn't want to slow down. See, I acknowledge women too. I think it's equal. But I mean, really hit the gas to say, I'm going to go in front of you. And it was a narrow thing. This pervasive rudeness, if people are pretty wound up right now. I do not see joy on faces that are like that. And this is a discussion of love. We're looking at joy, but it's not rude. It's not self-seeking. Remember, we talked about these things of people looking to me. Love is not self-seeking. It's not easily angered. It keeps no account of wrongs. And I come from the world heavyweight champion of grudge holders. Go back 80 years, and still mad at something that happened involving a doll. I can't, whether it's
This is his mother, for those who haven't heard this story.
whether it's genetic or from environment. But once again, you look at these things where we don't feel joyful. And yet Paul is in a discussion about love, about agape. Keeping no account of wrongs is an amazing thing. And you think about being joyful while you're mulling over what someone has done that they've wronged you somehow. Love takes no pleasure in evil. Last week we talked about rejoicing. David wrote those things, of the story of the death of Saul and Jonathan. And he says, don't tell this story in Gath or in Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice. And we said, it's possible to rejoice in something that's pretty unworthy. You can rejoice in the death of an enemy. It's not, you may have a momentary exultation, feeling of exhilaration over it. It's not joy and it doesn't last. And here's Paul talking about love. And he says that takes no pleasure in evil, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things. This is love, but to bear, when you think about having to bear a burden, and this morning we prayed for people who are bearing burdens. They have serious concerns about health and about family health. They're worried, they're bearing a burden, and this is hard, and I'm not minimizing it. Paul is talking about this agape love, and this love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. We talked about the peace that passes all understanding that will guard your hearts and minds. And here we're talking about the possibility of a love that endures and doesn't envy. How is that possible? It is difficult, like when Jesus is to turn the other cheek. Again, world heavyweight champion of grudge holders, the idea of it being possible to turn your cheek. If someone sues you for your tunic, give them your cloak also. The possibility of the existence of agape, of a love that transcends, that gives us the ability to do that. And we're talking about joy and we're talking about love, and they're not exactly the same thing, but they are so intertwined. You can see that. You can see that joy in the absence of this. You're going to go through periods like keeping account of wrongs and starting to get yourself worked up. There is no joy. What I find, what I see often, is that people get in a mode where they start keeping account of wrongs and it consumes them. They can never, it just becomes a never-ending cycle. And here's Paul talking about love, this love that comes from God, that comes through this sacrifice of Jesus that transcends that. It is possible. I'm not suggesting we can do it all the time, but you begin to see the connections on that. And she says, or he says, as Mary read, love never fails. Is it possible that there's a joy that doesn't have to fail, that there doesn't have to be? It's got to be connected to this. It has to be connected to this same agape kind of love. Where there are prophecies, you did read that part, right?
Yeah.
Where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they'll be restrained. And remember, he starts with this. Where there's knowledge, it will be dismissed. All of these things that are ours, they fade away. Oh, wait, two kingdoms, remember? There are two kingdoms at play. And these things that we tend to hold on to for, well, at least I've got more knowledge than the next person. Paul is telling us, and we see it, they fade away, they go. It is all temporary. So he says, where their tongues will be restrained, for we know in part, where there's knowledge will be dismissed. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial passes away. And I had already, as we study, we'd already come to the point that we were going to mention in this discussion of joy, the fact that recognizing there are two kingdoms at play here, the things that we touch that are temporary. And here's Paul in this discussion of love, talking about all of these things that we place so much value on, when that we only see in part. When the perfect comes, the partial passes away. There's your acknowledgement. There will come a point where we will see in full, and the partial will pass away, these things that we cling to. The idea of this kind of love and the joy that we seek are absolutely intertwined. They're part of a whole. You want to finish the?
Yeah. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I set aside childish ways. Now we see a dim reflection as in a mirror. Then we will see face to face. Now I know in part. Then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three things, faith, hope, and love, but the greatest of these is love.
So, it's a little bit of a continuation. I see as in sort of a warpy mirror, I see things, but they're distorted. They're temporary, as he says. But then at that time in the future, we shall see face to face. We'll understand God. We'll understand, hopefully, each other. Part of me says, will we ever understand each other? But he says this point comes when we will see clearly. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully. And this is the other beautiful thing that is in this little chapter, this section by Paul. I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. In the search for joy, this idea, the recognition that God knows us and loves us. Remember the teaching that the amazing thing is, while we were yet sinners, God loved us. I hear people say that God loves me the way I am, and that's true. They act like this is some big revelation that comes in the 21st century. They told us all that time ago. While we were yet sinners, we were broken, we're flawed, God still loved us. They knew that back then. I think that he loves us enough not to leave us that way. But you begin to see, what I'm wanting to show you is that the idea of joy and this kind of love are part of the whole. They describe the same things, and know that these remain. The things that don't fade away, the things that last, faith, hope, and agape. Not eros, not romantic love, not philos, brotherly love, agape love. These things endure, and the greatest of those is agape. Back to the discussion of joy. You see the connection between them. You see that this same hesed, this undeserved favor that we've talked about in the Old Testament, of God loving us enough, loving them enough, but it applies today to bring grace, to bring a blessing to them, is part of the agape, a part of the love that Jesus shows that he brings through this sacrifice.
Which takes us back to John. So we just recently studied John. And if you go back to John 15, and this goes back to the idea, we're never done with these books, or done with this book, even when we've studied it, sometimes you go back to the same verses and it connects something different, and this definitely. So that was Paul talking about love. Now we're going back to when Jesus was on earth, and John's Gospel, chapter 15, verse 9. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. Remain in my love. If you keep my commandments, you'll remain in my love, just as I kept my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you these things so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete.
Let's pause it there, because we got a reason for that. But, and by the way, those of you who can't see Mary tap me, and she has another Bible reading available, it's because she says, you've beaten that to death. It's time to move on. And she's right. I appreciate that. But Jesus is talking, and this is right before he's taken to be crucified. He's leaving them with some last stuff. As the Father has loved me, so I have loved you. And this is agape. This is that kind of love, that selfless love. As the Father's loved me, so I've loved you. Remain in my love. But then he says something that hangs people up. If you keep my commandments, you will remain in my love, just as I have kept my commandments and remain in his love. And people take that and they go, oh, this is about works. This is about the law. This is about keeping commandments. And if you do everything exactly right, I'll still love you. And if you don't keep my commandments, I won't still love you. And first of all, he's telling them to remain in his love. He's telling them to take part in this same agape. And I'm gonna explain that part. But he says, I've told you these things so that what? My joy, was Jesus joyful? Jesus was joyful. I've told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. Now, let's talk about the keeping commandments,
Should I
right?
read 12 and 13?
Yeah, we'll go, but he's, people take this and go, well, if you don't keep the commandments, and I've read and seen videos of these preaching people who say we're not out from under the law, and there's the proof of it. You got to keep commandments, right? You got to keep commandments. And if you don't, you're being misled. So he says, if you keep my commandments, and you'll remain in my love. Now go ahead and finish the last.
So verse 12, this is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that he laid down his life for his friends.
So there you see, he's talking about agape. He's talking about love. He's talking about, if you keep my commandments, this is going to be open to you. And lest there be any confusion, he says, this is my commandment. I just told you to do that. This is it, that you love one another as I have loved you. It's not as hard as we want to make it. Our son came to us, and we've mentioned this, but we're eating, and we're talking about something from church. He says, God has a lot of rules. And I said, Peter, really doesn't. I mean, people made a whole lot of rules, and there are certain ones. I'm not saying everything is good, but for instance, that bowl of spaghetti, if you turned it over and put it on your head, God doesn't have a rule against that. Right? There's no spaghetti rule.
It was a trip in our house, just so you know.
The idea that God is not making rules just because I want you to be little robots, and I want you to be stern, and I don't want you to smile, and I don't want people have represented that. What you find is that a lot of the things like the 10 Commandments, they got 10 commandments. And the Jewish leaders turned that into 613 what are known as mitzvahot, add-ons to it. And you don't mix the cotton and flax and stuff. And I don't know. There aren't that many rules, but just to be clear, what he says is, this is my command, that you love each other as I have loved you. And it sounds easy, right? The guy comes to Jesus and says, what do I have to do to take part in the kingdom of heaven? And he says, well, what does the law say? And he says, well, love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul, with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, good, go and do that. Sounds easy, right? So that's okay, good. Because if you do that, it'll take care of all the 10 commandments and the 613 mitzvot and the limitless variations that happen then in the Midrash teachings. It'll take care of that. Go, you've already got that instruction. But this idea of love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and might, love your neighbor as yourself, just keeps coming up. And a lot of the other things that there are rules about, and this is just me, but you find that, like thou shalt not kill. Well, first of all, that. But second of all, a lot of the things that are in these rules that we make so much, they're not good for you. It's not good for you to live that way. I would suspect that there's no joy at the moment of murdering someone, right? They're not good for you. And Jesus says, I want you to have a life more abundant. And here he says, so that my joy will be in you and your joy will be complete. And it all revolves, as he goes back to, love one another as I've loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than a man or woman should lay down his or her life for his friends or their friends, which he's about to do. You remember this takes place, as I told you, just before He goes out and is taken to be crucified. Everything has led up to this, and he is leaving these people who he loves with sort of one last instruction. So when we
I
talk
will
about
give them joy.
that, will leave them the opportunity, it will lead them to this same joy that we seek. And this week where Paul spoke, these things just all of a sudden began to be tied in a way that I'd never seen before. I treated, I guess, as they're separate things going on. They're part of a whole. One last one, and then we're going to finish with a psalm that Mary, dug out this week. And I think it's a perfect, beautiful way to end this. But in the book of John also, Jesus says, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you, and I don't give to you as the world gives, which is, give with one hand and take with the other. Do not let your hearts be troubled. Do not be afraid. To be at peace, it is hard to feel joyful when we're afraid. It may be impossible. I hate using that word. Somebody will come back to me. But when we're afraid for loved ones who have just been operated on, or we're afraid for a loved one who's about to undergo cancer therapy or is undergoing it, and he's saying, my peace, I'm about to leave, by the way, my peace I leave with you. Don't let your hearts be troubled. Don't be afraid. And it's a very, very hard thing. It is, there are times where we are overwhelmed. The question is, how do we get back from that place? And in this, I hope you've seen that where the answer, it's not to go look inside of yourself. It's not to say, I'm going to meditate until I'm strong enough to be unperturbed, to be not disturbed by anything, to be sort of vacant. It's to come back to that love, but it's also to love one another as he loved us. And it is undeniable that we find that when we're doing that, this idea of agape, of love others, that it is the gift to us is to be attached to this peace that he describes, and the joy. And so now the psalm, and I've talked enough.
So Psalm 16, I'm going to end with, and this is, once again, David wrote this psalm. And remember, Scott talked last week, one of David's big strengths is he always acknowledged God first. Preserve me, O God, for in you I take refuge. I said to the Lord, you are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. As for the saints in the land, they are the excellence in whom all my delights resides. Sorrows will multiply to those who chase other gods. I will not pour out their libations of blood or speak their names with my lips. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. I have made my lot secure. The lines of my boundary have fallen in pleasant places. Surely my inheritance is delightful. I will bless the Lord who counsels me. Even at night, my conscience instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me, because he is at my right hand. I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will dwell securely. For you will not abandon my soul to Sheol, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand.
So
16, Psalm 16.
So here we have David. Here we have a psalm. And as I've mentioned, David most of the time starts out with the who's who in the relationship. He starts out acknowledging God, his sovereignty, his goodness, his hesed. So he says, preserve me, for in you I take refuge. I said to the Lord, You are my Lord. Apart from you, I have no good thing. And this is David. This is so David. And this, go back to the Psalms, look at the beginning of so many of them. If it says it's a Psalm of David, see how many of them David starts out acknowledging God, acknowledging his sovereignty, acknowledging his goodness, and the fact that he brings us good things, that the good things stem from him. And he does this. Apart from you, I have no good thing. As for the saints, and that's actually a word that means holy. As for the and the idea that these are God's holy chosen people, but as for the saints in the land, they are the excellence in whom all my delight resides. Sorrows will multiply to those who chase other gods, and we go back to the beginning of this about people looking for their answers with other gods or within themselves. They do, by the way. We humans have a tendency to try and become their own God. And I'll talk about that at other times. I'll give you examples, but I'm not going to pour out their, I'm not going to even mention their name. I'm just not going to let their names cross my lips. If anything is good, if anything is excellent, if anything is praiseworthy, think on these things. Remember from Paul last week. If anything is excellent. Well, Paul didn't invent this. Here's David saying, I'm not even gonna let their name pass my lips. I'm not gonna dwell on that. The Lord is my chosen portion and my cup. You have made my lot secure. The lines of my boundary have fallen in pleasant places. Surely my inheritance is delightful. The lines of my boundary have fallen in pleasant places. He is acknowledging, as we said last week, that this world he's made, these places that he's given us to walk, are inherently good. But when we fail to acknowledge it, when we have these blinders of these other things, well, here's David acknowledging that God has given him pleasant places to walk, a good place to walk. And he says, my inheritance is delightful. That idea of inheritance, once again, that it's something that you get that you don't work for. It's hesed. I'm inheriting. I'm not earning. I don't deserve, but my inheritance is delightful. That's the same word. I looked it up. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he'll give you the desires of your heart. He'll put the connections this week have been incredible. I will bless the Lord. I will acknowledge and praise and give credit to the Lord who counsels me. Even at night, my conscience instructs me. I have set the Lord always before me. You want to make a cookbook for joy? I've set the Lord always before me. Buddhism talks about mindfulness, about being, it's not an invention there either. I will set the Lord always before me because he is at my right hand and I will not be shaken. Therefore, my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. He finds his way to joy, and he's telling you, this is what I do. My body also will dwell securely. Now, here's the last part I want to talk about. My body will dwell securely. And we're all aware, as Paul was, the outward man is wasting away. How do we reconcile those things? I'm going to read the next couple of lines. For you not abandon my soul to Sheol, you'll not let your Holy One see decay. And that, by the way, is recognized as messianic. That is a looking forward, the Holy One being the Messiah, being Jesus. You'll not let your Holy One see decay. But he says, you've made known to me the path of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence, with eternal pleasures at your right hand. Here is this future looking, this idea that there are two kingdoms at play. We find it from David in the Psalms. We find it from the beginning in Genesis. We find it when Jesus is about to be crucified. We find it when Paul is looking back. It's consistent. And I could go back, you want to go into the prophets, there's Joel, there's Hezekiah. I mean, as I did this the last several weeks, it's all part of one whole. It's all one thing. These are not Old and New Testament. They're part of one teaching, one history, and it says the same thing. And so what is it time? It's time. She just hit me again. It's time, and I've beaten it to death. As we look for joy, as you talk about joy, acknowledge God, acknowledge his goodness, look at the place that you're in without the burden of the grudges that you hold, the wrongs that you keep track of, without the envy and all those things that go with it, all the stuff we've talked about. If there's a recipe, it's that, and it's spread over the entire distance of these scriptures that we have. Seek God, love the Lord your God with all your heart and your soul and your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Bestow has said the same way it's bestowed on you. And it is a lot of the time almost backwards to us that we heard this last night. If you give more, you get more out of it. If you want to be first, make yourself last. And when you go to Christmas under the bridge, go to the people in need instead of the important people who spent some money to get their picture in the paper. We were put here for a reason, and we have those opportunities. And some of us, I think all of us at some level recognize truth in it, but maybe this helps at the times where we're tested to remember it and to find our path back. I'm sorry, I talked a lot. You have anything else?
No.
I don't like to do sermons.
Next week, we're gonna do the Sermon on the Mount, and I will and the Sermon on the Mount is only in one of the Gospels, and it's in Matthew 5, if you want to cheat and read ahead. And we are going to talk about that, and maybe I'm going to see if we can have the next week, during the week, have a virtual movie night to look at one of The Chosen. I'm going to.
The Chosen has one on Sermon on the Mount. We got to see if we can do it easily and if we can do it legally and all that. But if we can, I think it'd be a great thing. God, as we search for you, as we look for your will and your presence and your joy, we see, looking at the scriptures, but looking at the world around us, that you made a place for us, you made provision for us, and that there's a joy that we, a lot of the time, just walk away from. We forget to go back to the source of it. I'm encouraged. I love to read the part, God, where Jesus says what he came was to bring us life more, came for us to bring us life more abundant, that you actually want that for us. And what I ask for today, what I ask for us, is that reminder that the life more abundant is available through you and that it's around us, that you loved us enough to make that provision. And then you gave us the instruction to love others the same way. It's always the goal. It's always a thing that I ask for. Are the eyes and the heart to see those other people and those opportunities that you bring us constantly to share, to bring that same hesed, that same grace that you extend to us, and to show other people the kind of joy that you bring to us. Be with us this week. You know these ones that we're so concerned about. And we ask and we expect to see your hand on them and make them aware of that. Give them opportunities to recognize that you're here, that you're part of this world, and that your hand is on them. Amen.
You guys can unmute yourself.
Now, where you out, Luis?
Yeah.
That's, did that wear you out?
Can they hear it?
There.
On
Okay. Mary Ann Scott, I have to tell you, this is Sprinkles.
Oh, there it
And
is.
she, something about today made her come and be right here and listen to you guys. She's never come and been on my desk like this before, ever. So you spoke to Sprinkles today too, so.
That's so funny. Well, Virginia, let us know about Davey's birth, and we will be praying for you guys tomorrow.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will.
There you
Thank
go.
you.
And Terry, you take care in San Antonio, and we're praying for your mom.
You know what, you guys were on at the beginning and you heard that the septic system backed up and I'm out till 2 or 2:30 in the morning digging and stuff. And it's easy to look at things and lose sight of joy. And this study at least helped me say, oh, these are the times we're talking about. So on Saturday evening, after we've studied and done everything, I've got a list of scripture references that we want to talk about, and I print them. And last night I had all of them up, tab after tab, and I'm getting ready to print, and my charging port on my laptop just gave out. And so I don't have the ability to print them. And these things are just not nearly as,
Easy?
no, but they're also, they're not as bad. It's still a pretty good place. The septic system works. We found a way to bring the scriptures, and it's part of the stuff. Sometimes it's an opportunity to remember that it's still a good place.
You guys have a good week.
Thanks, you too.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.